All right. Before we get started, I don't know who left their Bible up here, but if you know of anybody missing their Bible, just send them my way and I will make sure they get it back. Okay. So, with that said, we are going to pick up 234. 234. All right. So last week, during the midweek class, we started talking about actually, let me back up one slide. We finished with the NIV, sort of. We finished that section with the NIV, and I said we really couldn't continue with the story of the NIV until we interrupted it with another translation. And so, working towards that, I introduced during the midweek class last week the Inclusive Language Lectionary. The Inclusive Language Lectionary, I talked about what a lectionary is. You can review that class. And what this happened in the early 1980s. This lectionary came out, and it was released by, let's see, can I get my cursor over here? Released by this group here, the National Council of Churches of Christ. They released this Inclusive Language Lectionary. And we worked through the preface. I have a lot to cover today, so I'm not going to go through the whole preface again. But the preface is inundated with tons of feminist rhetoric, such as the highlighted line here: women have been denied full humanity by a pattern of exclusion in English usage. And basically, they just work through and try to demonstrate that the Bible is oppressive to women. That's, they don't say it quite like that. That's how I'm saying it. But they go through in this preface and really harp on the patriarchy, harp on language in the Bible that's not inclusive of women. They go through, they minimize male bias reflections with language with regard to Christ and God as well. So this last line here: the formal equivalent adopted by this lectionary for God the Father or Father is God the Father and Mother, or God the Mother and Father. So yes, I can see your faces cringing. That's good. That's the reaction I had too as I worked through this. Oh, and this one was really the one that got me. When one says God, it is clear that if one means male God, one falls into idolatry. So this kind of language is riddled throughout this preface. And then we said, I used this part of the preface: an inclusive language lectionary is the first to rethink the language of Scripture as inclusive of both men and women, and as such, it is provisional and experimental. I'll come back to that real quick. There's another line I wanted to read. Here we go. In this lectionary, all readings have been recast so that no masculine word pretends to include a woman. When the scriptures are read in and to the church, they will not exclude half of those who hear. All who hear will know themselves to be equal. Okay, so like I said, lots of feminist rhetoric. Now, in this, they do raise valid translation concerns. And I said this in the midweek class. They raise valid translation concerns, but you can't even hear them. You can't hear the valid translation concerns because it's so riddled with feminist rhetoric. It spoils the whole situation. And so this week, what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the valid translation concerns from translations we trust. And in doing that, then we'll get to the stuff that goes too far. So the Inclusive Language Lectionary, just so you're aware, it's not a Bible translation. It is quoting the RSV and then recasting anything that has male-oriented language to be inclusive of feminine language, such as we just read for those who just walked in, God the Father is now God the Father and Mother, and God the Mother and Father. Okay, that's how it's read in this Inclusive Language Lectionary. Good. More scouring faces when I read this. This is this is what I'm looking for. And so back to this Inclusive Language Lectionary is the first attempt to rethink the language of Scripture. Okay, to be inclusive of both men and women, as if Scripture is not inclusive of women currently. And so I gave some examples, since some of you might have missed the midweek, I'll just run through the examples real quick because I only had a few, and I'll keep it short. But for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, RSV, very typical language, okay? Inclusive language lectionary, for God so loved the world that God gave God's only child. You got to get rid of that maleness in there, okay? RSV, he was in the world and the world was made through him, yet the world knew him not. He came to his own and his own people received him not. Inclusive language lectionary, updating the RSV here. The word was in the world and the world was made through the word, yet the world did not know the word. The word came to the word's own, but those to whom the word came did not receive the word. Okay? This is very inclusive because they got to get rid of the he pronouns. All right? No he pronouns in there. RSV, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And God said, I am the God of your ancestor, the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Isaac and Rebekah, the God of Jacob and Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. Got to get all those women in there as well. It's not what God said, but that's what they think God should have said. So moving on. Oh, we're in the Christmas season. We might as well read this one too. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And the ILL says, for unto us a child is born, to us an heir is given, and the government will be upon the shoulder of the one whose name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Mother, Prince of Peace. So I said in my class, I was unsure as to how the NCC was able to do this to the RSV because the RSV was under copyright. And so this is one of the reasons for copyright is to protect the text. So people can't do this. And so the question I had is, how was the NCC able to do this? And I worked through the class that basically the ICRE, which held the copyright to the RSV, was through a series of mergers. It was eventually dissolved, and the organization that absorbed it was the NCC, and therefore the NCC got the copyright to the RSV, so they were able to do this. And remember, I said that inclusive language lectionary was experimental. They were testing the waters. Our church is ready for this. Once they did that, the next move they had was to update the RSV. So in the early 1980s, we had the RSV. The RSV was announced to become the new Revised Standard Version, so the NRSV. And the National Council of Churches of Christ were going to be the organization that's going to oversee this revision. So as you can see, this is going to raise some problems. They also, I already went through their preface. If you want to go through their preface, the NRSV preface, watch the midweek class. I don't have time to keep going through all of this as review, but let me just say this last one here. During the almost half a century since the publication of the RSV, many in the churches have become sensitive to the danger of linguistic sexism arising from the inherent bias of the English language towards the masculine gender. A bias, in the case of the Bible, has often restricted or obscured the meaning of the original text. Okay? So you can see the NRSV is going right in that same line of thinking that the inclusive language lectionary is going to do. I did say this in the class, and I'll say it again now for clarity. The NRSV, or I should say the inclusive language lectionary, was experimental. I have a feeling, I don't have numbers, this is just me looking at the landscape and seeing the reaction. I have a feeling it didn't go over as well as they would have liked it to have. That it was not as widely received as they would have liked it to have been. And the reason I say that is because the NRSV pulls way back on this kind of language. It never once refers to God as mother, although in one instance I did see, it wasn't like God the parent, but it was talking about God as a father and said parent instead. I thought that was interesting. It was an analogy that was being used, so as a parent instead of as a father. I was like, okay, that one, I don't love that one, but it's close. That was the worst one I found with regard to the NRSV. But we're going to get into places where I think the NRSV goes too far. But like I said, the Inclusive Language Lectionary and the NRSV do bring up valid concerns with gendered language in translation. And it's hard to hear those concerns when you're inundated with feminist rhetoric. So today, my goal is to help bring some clarity to this gendered language in the Bible, how translators have to wrestle with it, okay? And we're going to do it from translations we trust as opposed to translations we don't trust to demonstrate this. And then you can see why a translation like this, one we don't trust, does some of the things that they do. So you can be fair with why they're doing that. And then once we filter out all of the noise, the stuff that we deal with legitimately, we can then clearly see the issues where they go too far. Okay? So that's my goal today. I don't know how far I'm going to get. I'm going to go as far as I can go. If I can't complete this today, I suspect I won't. But if I can't, I'll finish it in a midweek class and we'll continue to push forward. And so we will go from there. So let's go with this. So I'm going to show you, let's talk about gender and language. Okay? Gender and language. Gendered language in the Bible translation. In order to talk about this, we have to distinguish between grammatical gender and semantic gender. Okay? If you've been in the class long enough, you should pick up on what semantic gender means. It means when a word means a gendered thing. Okay? Grammatical gender, we don't have in English, so you may not be familiar with that. So we'll discuss that in a second. Grammatical gender in English, because we don't have grammatically gendered language in English, but Greek, Hebrew, French, Spanish, all of these languages have grammatical genders, okay? English doesn't have grammatical gender, but what we have is what's called natural gender, okay? So natural gender, when I say something like man, okay, the natural gender that you might think of is male human, right? I'm a man, so you might say, okay, Eric is saying that he is a male human, all right? But we also have man that can be used in the neuter, okay? Meaning human beings in general, mankind, okay? So we have that. And when I say mankind or man in that sense, I'm not referring to just male humans. I'm referring to all humans, okay? So there's that neuter coming into play when we talk about man in that sense, okay? Same thing. If you listen to a lot of, I would say about 50% of my classes, I will use the word guys frequently. I use guys all the time. And sometimes, almost never, actually, do I ever mean guys to mean men, boys, or fellows. Sometimes I do, but it's pretty rare. Most of the time when I say guys, I mean all of you. My mixed crowd here. I was listening to some of my earlier lessons and I dismissed almost every class by saying, you guys are all dismissed. I was not just dismissing the men. I was dismissing the whole class. I also did that intentionally, knowing that I was eventually going to teach this class. But I also say to my girls sometimes at bedtime, I say, I love you guys, right? But I'm only talking to 2 girls when I say that. I'm not using guys in the masculine, in the male sense. I'm using it in the neutered sense. Okay, and I could walk you through how that has happened over the years. Guys didn't always mean males. Sometimes it had an offensive term, then it became a term for men, and then it became a term that can refer to anybody. Next, they, their, them, themselves, plural. Neuter. You don't know if we're talking about males or females there, right? And this is a controversial one today because we're talking about they, them pronouns. And there's another way we can use they, their, them, and themselves, and that's in the singular sense in the neuter. And this is where most people will buck, referring to individuals by they, them pronouns. So this is not they, them pronouns like they want us to refer to them. In the plural sense, but we use them when we generally don't know the gender of the individual we're talking about. Okay, not when we're looking at them face to face and I can clearly tell that's a girl or a boy that I call them a they, them, but it's when I speak generically about a generic person that I don't know who their gender is, I'll use they, them pronouns. And And you might say, well, I don't think that's the case. And if I don't know the gender, I'll use he or something of that nature. But I opened the class by asking, do you know who left their Bible up here? Nobody left their Bible up here. This was just me probing the waters here. I said, do you know who left their Bible up here? Nobody batted an eye. And I said, if you hear of anyone missing their Bible, send them my way. I use they, them pronouns to talk about a singular person. And we do this all the time without even thinking about it. We use they, them pronouns about individuals to whom we don't know the gender of. So the Chicago Manual of Style is a style guide for writers. They also pick up on this. You can read the whole thing. I'm not going to for the sake of time. But when you read this, they're going to talk about pronouns that have number to them. We've talked about this in class already when we talked about thee, thy, and you and your in older Bibles. So pronouns that have number to them. So singular numbers like I, okay? Numerically singular. And then numerically plural, we. All right, it talks about those. As they refer to it, they say there are certain pronouns that used to indicate number that no longer do, such as you, right? We talked about that in class, and it's just so funny. I have to learn to be better about this, but in my class on italics, not italics, in my class about the ty pronouns, where we talked about plural being you and singular being thy, and that sort of stuff, I said something to the effect of, no translation is perfectly consistent in every feature, but I think the KJV is perfectly consistent in the ty pronoun distinction. And as soon as I said it, I said, someone's going to send me a message and show me a place where it's inconsistent. I know it's going to happen. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, this past week, I got a message from someone who just listened to that class and like, hey, just so you know, there is a place in which at least one place where the KJV is not consistent. In Deuteronomy 16:5, it says, for the Lord thy God is a jealous God among you, which should be plural, but the Hebrew there is singular. So the ASV gets this one right and says, for Jehovah thy God is in the midst of thee. And I looked other places where this exact phrase is used in the KJV, and they translate it the same way as the ASV, which is in the midst of thee. So that's where the KJV should have gone there. But like I said, and I should have just said it, no translation is perfectly consistent in every feature, okay? So while the KJV is generally consistent, and you can like 99.9% of the time rely on it to be consistent. All right. Enough of that side trail, rabbit trail. But then they reference they. So with the you distinction, the you, thou number distinction no longer existing, and you no longer carrying a number distinction with it, it can be plural or singular, and you can't tell. They also say this is the same thing that has happened with they. And the way they say it, they almost make it sound like this is a recent thing. And it's just the way they word it. It's not recent. So I went to the OED to see how this would work. And the OED says, with an antecedent referring to an individual generically or indefinitely, someone, a person, a student, used especially so as to make a general reference to such an individual without specifying gender. Use they, okay? And just so we're clear, let me get my cursor over here. This goes back to 1450. Is the earliest reference they could find of people using they in the singular sense when they didn't know what the gender was. 1450. So we're going back to like Wycliffe's time. All right. So, and notice there's no end date, I should say, which means this is still current today. We're still doing it. Now, before anyone thinks, oh, this is like, this is where the LGBTQ, all of that stuff, gender dysphoria stuff comes from. It's a twisting of this. It is not a use of this, because the OED reflects the change for that crowd as well. Remember, dictionaries, I said this early in class, but it's worth repeating now. Dictionaries aren't telling you how to use the language. They're telling you how to understand the language when someone's using it. Okay? It's a record of this is what people mean when they say this, not this is what you say when you say this, okay? It's a timestamp on English history. This is how people spoke then, okay? So This one, it says, used in reference to a person whose sense of personal identity does not correspond to conventional sex and gender distinctions, and who is typically asked to be referred as they rather than as he or she. Circa 2009, with no end date, which means some people are still using this today, or it's still in use today like this. The way we get an end date on here is we change the culture, and then we make this sense obsolete. Okay? And I would like to see that happen, where we change the culture to the degree that we can go back in history and be like, oh, they used to say it like that, but they don't anymore. All right? That would be semantic narrowing. Here we have semantic widening, broadening. If you remember these categories, semantic broadening, we added a sense to they. I'd like to see semantic narrowing happen where we drop a sense. Okay? All right, moving on. So how does this apply to translation? Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic have what's called grammatical gender. And I already showed you we don't really have that sort of thing in English. We don't have a direct comparison. But their grammatical gender kind of corresponds to our natural gender in the way we use it. So if you remember back when we talked about italics, I used the phrase turn on the light to try to get you to understand that allume la lumière is 3 words, but we have to say it in 4 words, turn on the light. And what do we do with that, okay, when it comes to italics? So we're going to do it again. And this time we're going to do it with gender, all right? So in English, turn off the light, it's too bright. In French, elle est trop forte. I probably butchered that pronunciation. Don't worry about it. So what's happening here is the word light. I've got my cursor over here. The word light, we have just the definite article the, right? French also has the definite article, but it's la, meaning it's feminine. So when they say it's too bright, they'll say elle. But if you look up elle by itself, it means she. Okay? So a direct correspondence would be she's too bright. But we would never say that, right? That's not how we speak in English. So we would say it's too bright. So their grammatical gender, feminine, is not semantic gender. They don't look at lights and think of them as feminine just because they use a feminine definite article. They are not looking at lights and being like, that's female. Does that make sense? Let me show you further. Grammatical gender. So in John 1 through 4, you're going to read about the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay? La parole. Parole is their word for word, and la is feminine. And so as you work down through John 1 through 4, you're going to hear the word being referred to in feminine pronouns. And if you translate those feminine pronouns directly into English, it almost sounds blasphemous. Okay? But that's because grammatical gender does not equal semantic gender. Grammatical, and so David Brunn, I used David Brunn's translation for this. It would have been pretty easy to do myself, but I actually wanted to bring David Brunn into this conversation. David Brunn is a career Bible translator. He has been doing this his whole adult life. He went to Papua New Guinea. He helped create their written language. They didn't have one. And he translated the Bible into their language, okay? Lamagai. David Brunn is a conservative, complementarian, Christian man who's been doing this work his whole adult life. And when he talks about this sort of thing, grammatical gender versus semantic gender, he uses this example. This is his example. And he says, inevitably, he almost always has a French person come up to them and say, you're right, it does say that, and I've never thought about it in feminine terms before. And his point is because semantic gender, grammatical gender doesn't equal semantic gender. They don't say elle and think female. They say elle and think whatever gender is being applied to the person or thing that they're talking about. They know the word is male. And so they say elle, but they don't correspond elle to female. They correspond it to male because the semantic gender is distinct from the grammatical gender. Okay? So, The exact same thing is happening in Hebrew and Greek. Now, translators have to wrestle with this because we have semantic gender, we have grammatical gender in Hebrew and Greek, and they have to figure out how to put it into semantic gender. And that's where translators have to wrestle. And so let's start with something that's universally agreed upon. In Ezekiel 44:25, it talks about a priest who can't come into contact with a dead person. Now, the word highlighted person there, okay, is the Hebrew word Adam. Adam, 99% of the time in especially formal Bibles, is going to be translated as man. Okay? Man. Adam. And so no dead Adam is what's being said here. But you can see every single translation goes gender neutral. They make sure you know it's that a priest can't come in contact with a person, not a male person, any kind of person, male or female. So all the translations here universally agree that the best way to handle this verse is by rendering it in the gender neutral, okay? That we don't say man here because it could be confusing. It might imply that priests can't come into contact with dead men as opposed to dead human beings, okay? Across the board, all translations do this. So if you're like, I don't like when we go to gender neutral pronouns, they're all doing it, all right? Or gender neutral nouns. We'll get into pronouns later. All right, let's give you another one. 1 Timothy 3b and 4a, God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved in the KJV, all men to be saved. ESV says all people to be saved. LSB says men. NASB 20, people. CSB, everyone. NKJV, men, people, everyone. People, everyone. All right? So you can see we have a grammatically masculine noun. But that grammatical masculine noun is gender neutral semantically. Because it is not God's will that only males be saved. Unless you want to argue that point, which some have in the past. And they said all women are going to have to turn into men before they get to heaven. Okay, that is not a common day heresy, but it is in the Gospel of Thomas, if you ever want to read that. All right, all women will have to become men. That's not what's being said. It's saying God wants all people to be saved, not just men. So some translations render it that way. And if you have a problem with translations rendering it that way, you have to make one of two arguments. You either have to make the argument I just said, which is it actually means males, and therefore you shouldn't make it gender neutral. Or you have to say that synonyms are, you can't use synonyms in the Bible. Because a synonym for man in this case is people. And you absolutely can use synonyms, and there's not a preface on the planet that you're going to find that says, we will not use synonyms, okay? Some will say, well, attempt to use concordance, knowing that we can't always, okay? So there's that one. And then there's option 3, that this is a totally acceptable rendering, and there's nothing to complain about here, okay? There's no reason people should be complaining here. Let's move to another example. Because I'm going to move to more and more complicated examples as we go to show you how this gets more complicated for translators. So here it says, the KJV says, and your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest. ESV says sons. The Greek word here is generally the word for sons. And you can see, so some say sons, some say children. So some will argue here that retaining sons is important because the inheritance is given to sons, okay? But then the question is, does it then therefore not apply to females? Are you suggesting then that you shall not, that females cannot be children of the highest, only males can be? So if it's metaphorically sons, or if it's, I should say not metaphorically, if it is semantically gender neutral, but grammatically male, then this children is synonymous with son in this case, okay? So if a woman was in the crowd when she heard this, would she have thought to herself, I'm excluded from this because I'm not a son? And the answer would be no. all right? It applies to both genders. So it applies to all of God's children regardless. Never mind the fact that there are plenty of precedents in the Old Testament of females getting inheritances as well. Okay, we have more than one example of that. And again, you can't accuse, and this is why I bring this one in, you can't accuse the KJV translators of bowing to feminist rhetoric and changing this to a gender neutral term. This was not impacting their culture. It was not even a thought in their mind. They changed it to children because they thought it was more clear. Okay, that's why they did it. They also said in their preface, we're free to use synonyms. Don't hold us to one translation. Go back to listen to the preface. They spend a significant portion of their preface talking about that it's okay to use synonyms. Okay, so you can't accuse the KJV of bowing to feminism. That would be anachronistic and silly. Let's go to a more complicated one. Oh, we're back to this verse. Remember this verse, the universal agreement here on the word Adam, right? Or Adam is rendered person here. But this gets a little bit more complicated in this same verse when we go to the beginning. And they, the KJV, and they shall come to no dead person. ESV, they shall not defile themselves. LSB, they, with a footnote. NASB, they. CSB, a priest. NKJV, they. NIV, a priest. NLT, a priest. LEB, he. NRSV, they. The pronoun that starts this verse in the Hebrew is grammatically masculine. It is masculine and it is singular. It is he. And the only translation up here that renders the he, in probably the most awkward way they could have done it, and near a dead person, he shall not come to be defiled. Okay? That, just so people are aware, the LEB is for me on the formal side, with the NLT for me is on the functional side. It's more formal than necessary. They don't. They suggest it's intended to be a complement to your primary Bible, just like I use the NLT to be a complement to my primary Bible. Okay, so the Hebrew here is singular, masculine, grammatically. Singular, masculine, grammatically. And you will notice, I just find it fascinating that all the translations up here that render it they are all the formal ones. They're all the ones that people will point to and say they render the genders more appropriately. They retain the he's and so on and so forth. And it's the more functional ones that retain at least the singular. They repeat the noun, with the exception of the LEB up there. I just found this fascinating when I came across this verse, and I was like, oh, the KJV here went from he to they. So is this talking about a priest? And here's the thing, we even know priests are masculine. Like, I should say male. We know that priests are male. So it would have been totally appropriate to make this he. Any one of these translations could have said, and he shall come at no dead person. And it would have been totally understandable. He shall not defile himself. The LSB, or I should say the NASB family, they footnote it. That's what the footnotes are here. They're like, literally, this says he. This is actually how I picked up on it. I was like, wait a minute. It literally says he, and there's no reason not to do this. The reason I think that this happened is because the KJV translators decided to do it, and it's just stuck. And people have just chosen not to translate it. And the translations that do are the ones that are the ad fontes translations, with the exception of the NLT, but it's pretty ad fontes. It's about as close to ad fontes as you can get without being it. But the NIV and the CSB are ad fontes translations, so they got to that and they looked, remember I said they scrutinize every single word. And they got there and they're like, why are we doing this? Why are we using these? Now here is a place where it's not plural in English, it's singular. Okay? Just like I used, does anybody know who left their Bible here? I use their. I don't mean plural, I mean singular. That's what's happening here. Right? It's singular. It's referring to a priest. And here's where the CSB translators come into play, and I find this interesting. I'm not saying that this is the right way to handle this situation, but this was their position. They said, in cases where we could use they, we're not going to. when it should be, when we can use he, we will not use they. All right? And the reason why is in their mind, they say they, in most people's mind, the uppermost sense is plural. And so they have to make a decision. They have to prioritize. Do we risk saying he and causing people to think that females aren't included? Or do we risk saying they and think that, and cause people to think maybe that it's a plural instead of a singular? They had to weigh this. They said, we're going to retain the gender at the risk of causing people to think it's only males that are being referenced, okay? That was a decision they made. Are they 100% perfectly consistent? I don't know. Probably not. I'm not going to say that they are and then get another message this week and be like, no, here's the place they didn't do it, okay? So there's that. But that's why they go with priest here. They just write a priest, even though it's just a pronoun in Hebrew. They're repeating the noun. They're making it clear and moving on. Let's go to one that is even more difficult. We're doing pretty good. Okay, so now we've got and established a baseline. Let's look at this one. Therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved, and longed for, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. Philippians 4:1. Here we've got, probably this is the one that most people bring up. They start talking about how brothers and sisters enter our translation. So we've got brethren, brothers with a footnote, brothers and sisters with italics, brothers and sisters, brethren, brothers and sisters, brothers and sisters, brothers and sisters. All right. So the underlying Greek word here is the word for adelphoi. All right. We're going to get to the KJV and NKJV's use of brethren in a second. So just hold on to that one. We're going to just deal with brothers versus brothers and sisters first. So the Greek word is adelphoi. It can be translated as brothers, like biological siblings, okay? It can also be translated or understood as brothers with someone you deeply care about, like family, though they're not family. It can also be more generally people whom you share life experiences with or membership in an organization, including religious contexts, okay? So and the best way to tell which of those is being used is through context. Okay? And when you read the context of this passage, you have a lot of clues that this is referring to people in general in the context. Because the very beginning of the book of Philippians, Paul is clear that he's writing to all of the saints in Philippi. So the book is written to all of the saints. Immediately after this verse in Philippians 4:1, you go to 4:2, he starts addressing two women specifically. So he says, hey, dearly beloved, and these two women, you guys need to be united, okay? You're not united, get united, okay? And then everything that follows should be applied to all believers in general. Like, you shouldn't read the following list and think, oh, only men should be doing these things, all right? Having their mind united and so on and so forth. So most translations reflect this by including brothers and sisters. The ESV here uses a footnote. So they put brothers in, and then a footnote, they say brothers and sisters. Keeping in mind here, I've already talked about this, your footnote is just as good as scripture, so don't bypass it, okay? All right. Now, when we look at the word brother, you can see there's an older sense, so let's see. As you can see from the Webster Dictionary, we have an older sense that does not necessarily relate to males anymore, but related to one another in common ties. So brother can be related to one another by common ties or interest. So when you read brother here, you should be thinking of brother in that way. People who are related by common ties or interest. With regard to the word brethren, you can see that it can refer to members of a particular organization, a group, especially a religious group, as brethren. And then you can see that this is old-fashioned, according to Collins English Dictionary. It means it's falling out of use. We don't say this much anymore. It's old-fashioned. And that's where the NASB 20, I said I was going to try to remember to come back to the NASB 20 on the subject of brethren. I'm not going to read this for the sake of time, but basically that's what they say here. Brethren has fallen out of use. It's falling out of use. We don't really use it anymore. It's awkward to use in English. So instead, we're going to go with brothers and sisters. So you are understanding that it is both males and females being referenced, not just males. And then they say, and we're going to put it in italics, so you're aware that and sisters, those words aren't in Greek. However, they are implied by the word adelphoi, okay? The plural of that. All right, just takes more words. I want to try to get through this next section here. So you can see some translations are trying in one way to convey that males and females are being addressed, but some are very clear about it, and some are more obscure. For the more common reader, I think it is better to be clear and accurate than to be obscure and possibly misunderstood, okay? In this case, there isn't a single commentary, not one, in which even the most liberal ones, even the most conservative ones, would suggest that males are the only ones being addressed here. I couldn't find one. I wanted to see if there's, at least in a commentary, like, we really think it's males only. Any of them that addressed it, most of them don't address it. Any of them that addressed it was clear that this is in reference to males and females. All right, now let's go to probably the most complicated one, and boy, I'm running close on time. I'm gonna have some fun with this one, but let's try to move quickly. So there's a lot going on here. You see all sorts of colors up here, and because I'm running out of time, I'm not gonna work through this so specifically, but I'll read the verse in the KJV. And in those days, Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples, this is Acts 1:15 through 16a, disciples, and said, he didn't say this part, this is just KJV semantic issues here. The number of the names together were about 120. Men and brethren, the scripture must needs have been fulfilled. Okay, let's read it in the ESV where it's a little easier. In those days, Peter stood up among the brothers. The company of persons was in all about 120 and said, brothers, the scripture had to be fulfilled. All right. I'm going to skip through this. I'm going to review this in the class more nuanced, but I'm just going to get to the crux of the point here. The issue here is that the word adelphoi is being used. The number of people is the word names, generally related to people. And then the next one, Peter addresses, I want to make sure, aneres adelphoi, which translates specifically as how the LSB has it, men brothers, okay? And so people say, it says men brothers. Like he's being super clear that men are the only ones in view here. Peter, in the crowd, is only addressing the men. And to change this one, because it's so clear in the Greek, would be to just bow to feminist rhetoric. That's always where they go, is you're just bowing to feminist rhetoric. So the CSB here is bowing to feminist rhetoric because they went with brothers and sisters when it just says men brothers here. Okay. As we're closing out the class, I want to bring in John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom is a native Greek speaker. He speaks Greek. He reads the Greek Bible. He's not reading a translation. It's his mother tongue. He has a sermon on this passage, and he answers this. Or I shouldn't say answers, because he's not responding to feminist rhetoric. He exegetes this, is the better term. He exegetes this passage. And this is what he has to say. But observe how Peter does everything with the common consent, nothing imperiously. He does not speak thus without a meaning. But observe how he consoles them concerning what had passed. In fact, what happened had caused them no small consternation. For if there are many now who canvass this circumstance, what may we suppose they had to say then? Men, brothers, says Peter. If even the Lord called them brothers, all the more should Peter when they were all present. What dignity of the church! What angelic condition! There was no distinction then, neither male nor female. I wish churches were like that now. No one had the mind full of worldly matter. No one was anxiously thinking about the household concerns. In this way, even temptations may become a benefit and afflictions an advantage. Wherefore, at the beginning, he said, men and brethren, it behooves to choose from among you. He defers to the decision to the whole body, thereby both making the elected objects of reverence and himself, keeping clear of all invidiousness with regard to the rest. I don't think Chrysostom could have been any more clear that when he read men, brothers, he did not think, that semantic, grammatical gender did not equal semantic maleness. In his mind, he read that and he saw everyone in the church, males and females, without confusion. So that's the spoiler alert. I'm going to work through this more slowly during the midweek class. But I really wanted to get that in here. So what you can't do, let me close out by saying this. What you can't do, you can't accuse John Chrysostom of bowing to feminism. In fact, if you know anything about him, it'd be antithetical to his entire character. Okay? He was not a feminist in any regard. You can't accuse him of not knowing the Greek language. He was a native speaker. And so you shouldn't accuse translations that agree with Chrysostom on the exegesis of this passage by going with brothers and sisters as bowing to feminist rhetoric. They are trying to be semantically accurate, not necessarily grammatically accurate. I'll deal with this more nuance in the midweek class, and we'll continue this discussion, but I really wanted to get to this point, so I was happy I did, and we'll pick this up in the midweek. You all are dismissed. Thank you.